What if the greatest mystery in the Bible was never the flood itself, but what survived after it? If this sounds unbelievable, stay with this carefully, because the evidence becomes far more disturbing as the story unfolds. Because according to Scripture, the waters destroyed every living thing on earth. Entire civilizations vanished. Mountains disappeared beneath the deep. Humanity was erased in judgment. And yet, centuries later, the Bible speaks of giants walking the earth again. Not legends, not myths, giants, living descendants connected to the Nephilim. So how is that possible? Stay with this carefully, because the answer lies in details most people completely miss in ancient texts. If the flood truly wiped out all flesh, then the return of the Nephilim becomes one of the most terrifying contradictions in biblical history. And once you follow the evidence from Genesis to Numbers, from ancient Hebrew texts to the post-flood kingdoms of Canaan, the implications become impossible to ignore. Genesis 6 reveals that before the flood, the sons of God took the daughters of men as wives, and from that forbidden union came the Nephilim, beings of enormous strength and unnatural power. These giants spread violence across the earth until corruption consumed nearly all humanity. Scripture says that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The world had become spiritually polluted beyond recovery. Then judgment came. God chose Noah because he was righteous in his generation, described in the original Hebrew as being perfect in his generations. While the earth collapsed under divine wrath, Noah was commanded to build the ark and preserve life from total extinction. The fountains of the deep burst open, the windows of heaven were unleashed. Waters rose above the mountains, and every creature that breathed air perished outside the ark. The destruction was absolute. Humanity's first world was gone forever. Or so it appeared at first. But the mystery did not end with the flood. Centuries later, the Bible reveals something shocking. The giants had returned. When Moses sent spies into Canaan, they came back terrified. In Numbers 13, they reported, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak. They even said, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." These were not just tall warriors. Entire clans of giants were living in the land. The Anakim, the Rephaim, and later the giants faced by David all appeared long after the flood had supposedly erased every corrupted being from the earth. So how could this happen? Genesis 6 contains a mysterious phrase many scholars still debate. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Those final words may explain everything. Some believe fallen angels returned after the flood and repeated their rebellion. Others believe traces of corrupted bloodlines survived through Noah's descendants. Either way, one terrifying possibility emerges. The war that began before the flood may never have truly ended. One explanation argues that the flood did not end the rebellion, it only paused it. According to this theory, a second intrusion of fallen beings occurred after the waters receded. The sons of God once again interacted with human women, producing a new line of hybrid offspring. Ancient apocryphal writings, especially the Book of Enoch, describe 200 watcher angels descending to Mount Hermon with forbidden intent. These beings are said to have taught humanity hidden knowledge, warcraft, astrology, and forbidden sciences, triggering another wave of corruption. Their unions with human women would explain the reappearance of Nephilim after the flood. This idea is often linked to biblical passages describing angelic rebellion. Jude chapter 6 states, "Angels who did not keep their original dignity but left their own dwelling are kept in eternal chains." Yet, the text leaves tension. Were all rebels judged equally, or did different groups face different consequences? Some ancient interpretations suggest fragmentation among the fallen. Certain angels were immediately bound, while others remained active, continuing their influence over humanity. This raises a deeper question. Why would a second rebellion mirror the first if the first ended in catastrophic judgment? The theory suggests the conflict was never fully resolved, only displaced. A second, even more unsettling theory suggests the flood did not fully erase the Nephilim from history. Genesis 6:13 states, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." That final phrase, "and also afterward," has puzzled translators for centuries, hinting at something unresolved in the timeline of judgment. One interpretation proposes that remnants of Nephilim blood survived through Noah's family line. While Scripture describes Noah as perfect in his generations, it does not extend that same genetic purity to his sons' wives. If any carried traces of corrupted lineage, the bloodline could have re-entered humanity after the ark. This idea is often connected to later biblical tensions, including the curse of Canaan, son of Ham, after the incident in Noah's tent. Some ancient rabbinical traditions suggest this curse reflects a deeper, pre-existing corruption within that lineage. Centuries later, the narrative intensifies. The land of Canaan is described as inhabited by giants. Og, king of Bashan, is remembered as the last of the Rephaim, with an iron bed measuring about 4 meters. Goliath of Gath stands around 3 meters tall. Deuteronomy also names the Emim, Zamzumim, and Anakim, entire peoples described as extraordinarily large and militarily dominant. From this perspective, the conquest of Canaan takes on a different meaning. It is not only territorial warfare, but a confrontation with persistent corruption re-emerging within human history. Joshua's campaigns and David's battles against figures like Goliath, Ishbi-Benob, and Saph suggest the issue did not vanish after the flood. Even recurring traits, such as polydactyly extra fingers, mentioned in several accounts, are interpreted by some as possible genetic markers of this lineage. The question remains open. Was this simply myth, or a surviving trace of something the flood was meant to erase completely? Another set of traditions introduces an even more extraordinary claim. Og of Bashan may have survived the flood itself. Some ancient Jewish accounts suggest he clung to the outside of the ark, sustained only by provisions passed through an opening, never granted full entry. This narrative attempts to explain how a figure tied to the Rephaim could still appear in later biblical history. Alongside this comes a third, more controversial theory, one that shifts from survival to lost knowledge. Texts associated with the Book of Enoch describe fallen beings teaching humanity forbidden techniques, manipulation of seed, hybridization, and unnatural forms of reproduction. If interpreted broadly, this raises the possibility that pre-flood civilizations possessed rudimentary forms of biological engineering capable of preserving or altering genetic material across generations. This idea echoes wider global traditions. Many ancient cultures, Sumerian, Egyptian, and Mesoamerican, preserve stories of towering beings who emerged after catastrophic floods, bringing knowledge of architecture, agriculture, and astronomy. These shared patterns raise a difficult question. Are they symbolic myths or fragmented memories of a real pre-cataclysmic world? That question becomes more intense when examining ancient structures that still defy easy explanation. Baalbek in Lebanon contains megaliths estimated at over 800 tons, positioned with extraordinary precision. Puma Punku in Bolivia features stone blocks cut with sharp, uniform angles that challenge conventional assumptions about ancient engineering capabilities. Taken together, these accounts and structures form a troubling pattern, one that suggests either lost technological knowledge, extraordinary ancient capability, or something entirely beyond modern categories of understanding. Ancient translations of Scripture add another layer to the mystery. The Septuagint renders the term Nephilim simply as giants, but the original Hebrew root naphal carries a deeper meaning, the fallen, or those who cause others to fall. This shifts the interpretation entirely. The Nephilim were not defined only by size, but by conditioned beings associated with rebellion and corruption, tied to the legacy of defiant celestial beings. Their existence is described as a fusion of physical presence and spiritual deviation, spreading violence wherever they appeared. Some apocalyptic Jewish traditions go even further. They suggest that after death, the Nephilim did not simply disappear. Instead, Their spirits became disembodied entities associated with oppression and disturbance, contributing to an unseen layer of spiritual conflict within human history. The Book of Enoch intensifies this portrayal. It describes beings of extraordinary longevity, some said to live beyond 500 years, with an appetite so vast it strained entire societies. When resources failed, the narrative escalates into collapse, depicting a world where consumption turns into devastation and humanity itself becomes threatened. In this interpretation, the Nephilim era was not only a physical crisis, but a total breakdown of order, moral, social, and spiritual. A civilization overwhelmed from within, where corruption spread as widely as violence, and the boundary between human and something beyond human became increasingly unstable. Ancient scripture hints that the Nephilim may not be isolated figures in one tradition, but echoes of a far older global memory. Genesis refers to them as renowned men of old, a phrase that some interpret as surviving reflections of powerful beings preserved in myth across civilizations. Across cultures, similar patterns emerge, figures described as part human, part divine, possessing immense strength and unnatural longevity. Greek titans, heroes like Hercules, and the Mesopotamian king Gilgamesh all carry overlapping traits. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a hybrid identity that mirrors the Nephilim narrative. His pursuit of immortality and his encounter with a flood survivor echo themes found in Genesis, suggesting shared narrative roots rather than isolated myths. From this perspective, the Nephilim story expands beyond one text into a wider ancient pattern. Stories of powerful hybrid beings remembered differently across cultures after a global catastrophe. This idea connects with another layer of interpretation: spiritual conflict behind human history. The Old Testament repeatedly presents warfare not only between nations, but between unseen forces influencing empires and rulers. Daniel chapter 10 describes princes associated with kingdoms, suggesting an organized spiritual hierarchy operating behind political power. Within this framework, some interpretations argue that corruption was not only moral, but structural, targeting human lineage itself. The flood is then seen as a reset, preserving what Scripture calls a pure line through Noah, described as righteous and intact in his generations. Yet the later reappearance of giants introduces tension back into the narrative. It suggests that whatever was removed may not have been fully eliminated. This leads to another recurring biblical theme: separation. The repeated warnings against intermixing with surrounding nations are sometimes interpreted as more than cultural boundaries. In books like Ezra and Nehemiah, drastic measures, including forced separation of marriages, are taken, implying concerns deeper than politics alone. Across these interpretations, the central question remains unresolved. Was this conflict purely historical, or part of a larger unseen struggle shaping human history from the beginning? Fragments of the Book of Giants, preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, expand this mystery even further. In these ancient texts, the Nephilim are described as receiving ominous dreams, foretelling their own destruction in an approaching flood. Yet the narrative suggests they were unable to escape their fate, trapped in a condition that was neither fully human nor fully divine, leaving no path to restoration or redemption. From this perspective, the flood becomes a complete separation. Only uncorrupted humanity is preserved, while hybrid beings are erased from existence. The judgment is described as total, leaving almost no physical trace behind. And yet, echoes of these beings appear across global traditions. Greek mythology speaks of titans. Norse legends describe the Jotun. Hindu texts mention the Asuras. Polynesian oral histories describe towering builders associated with ancient monuments, while some Native American traditions preserve accounts of unusually large, human-like figures. Despite cultural distance, these stories share striking similarities: giants, hybrid origins, and catastrophic destruction. Even more compelling is the recurring motif of a global flood. Over 200 cultures preserve narratives of a great deluge, featuring a righteous survivor, a vessel of preservation, animals saved from extinction, and a renewed beginning for humanity. The consistency of these core elements raises a difficult question about shared historical memory rather than isolated myth. If the flood narrative carries historical weight, then the earlier existence of Nephilim also becomes a question that cannot be dismissed easily. This opens another controversial layer of the discussion: archaeology itself. Across centuries, reports have surfaced describing unusually large skeletal remains, from 19th century excavation notes to early explorer accounts in South America. Some reports even describe remains far exceeding normal human proportions, though many were later dismissed or lost. While modern archaeology often classifies such findings as errors, hoaxes, or misidentifications, the repetition of similar claims across different eras and continents continues to provoke debate. The central tension remains unresolved, whether these accounts reflect misinterpretation, myth-making, or traces of something far older embedded in human history. A more conventional explanation suggests the Nephilim may not have been supernatural at all, but the result of extreme environmental conditions in a pre-flood world. Some theories propose that the antediluvian atmosphere had higher pressure and oxygen levels, potentially creating conditions that allowed for greater human growth and unusually long lifespans. In this view, the world before the flood was physically different, almost engineered for longevity and size. Some researchers within creationist frameworks even suggest a protective atmospheric canopy that stabilized environmental conditions, like a planetary pressure chamber. This could, in theory, explain both the extended lifespans of early biblical figures and the emergence of unusually large humans recorded in ancient texts. But this still leaves a deeper question unresolved. Were the Nephilim simply biological anomalies, or something beyond natural explanation? Some interpretations push further, proposing the involvement of non-human intelligences influencing human genetics or development. If such interference were real, it would fundamentally challenge the assumption that history is governed only by natural processes. This is why the debate extends beyond archaeology or biology. It becomes a question about the structure of reality itself, whether the physical world is closed or whether external forces can intervene within it. Connected to this is another layer of the narrative: the world before the flood itself. Ancient texts describe a civilization influenced by beings said to possess knowledge far beyond early human capacity. These accounts attribute to them advancements in metallurgy, astronomy, architecture, and other fields that appear suddenly in human history. If taken literally, this suggests a pre-flood civilization that developed rapidly under external influence, reaching levels of complexity that were later erased almost completely by the flood narrative. After this reset, human lifespan and conditions appear dramatically reduced. Figures such as Noah are described living nearly a millennium, while later generations show a sharp decline, Shem living 600 years, and Abraham around 175. This gradual reduction is often interpreted as evidence of a changed world, environmental, biological, or both. In this framework, the disappearance of giants and long-lived beings is not sudden but gradual, fading as the post-flood world stabilizes into conditions closer to what we recognize today. The final giants recorded in Scripture are said to appear during the era of King David, around 1,000 years before the Common Era. After this period, references to beings of extraordinary stature steadily fade from the historical record, raising a persistent question. Did they simply disappear over time, or were they actively removed due to being viewed as a destabilizing force within human societies? Within the biblical narrative, certain commands directed toward the conquest of Canaan include the destruction of groups associated with the Anakim and other giant lineages. These accounts are often interpreted as more than territorial conflict, but as an effort to remove what was seen as a deeply rooted form of corruption embedded within specific populations. This interpretation frames the conquest not as random violence, but as a targeted act aimed at ending a recurring problem that had persisted since earlier biblical events. The Israelites are depicted as agents carrying out a judgment that extends the consequences of the flood into later history. However, the narrative also shows incomplete execution. Some groups survived, particularly in coastal regions linked to the Philistines. From these populations later emerge figures such as Goliath, suggesting that the issue was not fully resolved, but carried forward into subsequent generations. This sets the stage for the confrontation between David and Goliath. David's victory is portrayed not only as a military achievement, but as a decisive moment in the long struggle against the last remaining expressions of this threat. Each confrontation is presented as part of a broader arc where repeated encounters gradually reduce and eventually eliminate the visible presence of giants in the biblical world. The narrative then shifts from earthly conflict to the origin of that corruption itself. According to Genesis, creation was structured with clear boundaries, each being reproducing after its kind. Within that order, the union between heavenly beings and human women represents a rupture in the natural framework of creation. The result, described in the text as Nephilim, is portrayed as a hybrid existence that should not have emerged under the original design. In this interpretation, the event is not accidental or symbolic. It is framed as intentional defiance against the established order, a breach that alters humanity at its most fundamental level. The implication is severe. If human lineage can be altered at its core, then the entire trajectory of creation becomes vulnerable to corruption. Genesis 6 intensifies the picture, stating that all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. The language suggests total systemic breakdown, not isolated wrongdoing. At this point, the flood is presented not as punishment alone, but as a corrective reset when corruption reaches irreversible levels. Only Noah is described as maintaining integrity within his generation, making him the sole viable continuation of humanity's original line. His family becomes the foundation of post-flood existence, preserved because the structure of creation itself is being restarted. The Ark, in this framework, is more than survival. It functions as a preservation system for unaltered life. Every creature taken aboard represents continuity of species in its intended form, protected from further distortion. Genesis 7 emphasizes that destruction outside was absolute, reinforcing the idea of a complete reset of the corrupted world. From here, the narrative moves into a restored world, but one question remains unresolved. Was corruption truly removed, or only contained? The story reaches its final conclusion, where covenant and judgment define the end of the Nephilim narrative. After the flood, God establishes a covenant with Noah, promising that the earth will never again be destroyed by water. Yet prophetic texts shift the form of final judgment, not water, but fire, described as a far more complete and irreversible purification. Within this framework, everything tied to corruption is ultimately brought to account. The Nephilim, in various interpretations, are placed within this final judgment framework. Apocalyptic writings describe a definitive separation, where nothing aligned with rebellion remains in the restored order of creation. Texts such as Revelation 20:10 frame this outcome as a prepared destiny for forces connected to rebellion, reinforcing the idea of an ultimate end beyond human history. From this view, the Nephilim are part of a much larger arc that begins before the flood and concludes only at the final judgment. Although their physical presence fades from history, their influence is portrayed as continuing in more subtle forms, seen in ongoing spiritual conflict rather than physical giants. The key warning becomes clear. Some interpretations suggest the forces behind ancient corruption are not simply gone. They reappear in different forms across time. The days of Noah are described as a period of violence and sudden judgment, echoed again in later prophetic warnings. In the end, the narrative is not just about the past, but a pattern suggesting cycles of corruption, restraint, and final restoration that shaped the entire biblical worldview. If you followed this entire investigation, the next chapter reveals even deeper connections hidden across ancient scriptures.